The end of World War II saw two opposing superpowers emerging in the form of the United States of America and the Soviet Union. The United States was capitalist, a system where almost everything is privately owned and run for profit. The Soviet Union was communist, a system where everyone owns the means to create a common wealth, all based around a central ideology.
All right, beautiful people. So at around 20 seconds, that gives you your first answer here, right? The two opposing superpowers were the United States and the Soviet Union. One of the ideologies was called capitalism, and that was held by the United States of America. The other ideology, which is basically an idea, it's a fancy word for idea on how governments and people and nations should run. The other ideology was communism, held by the Soviet Union. These two ideologies from these two superpowers essentially split up Europe. So that's the first answer right there.
After dealing with Nazi Germany, these two superpowers sought to spread their influence throughout the world, and thus the Cold War began. The Cold War wasn't a direct war, but a series of proxy wars and decades of intimidation, propaganda, and espionage. Germany was occupied after the war. The Soviets controlled the area around Berlin, but not all the city itself. There were already tensions between the Soviet Union and the Western Allies, as they felt threatened by each other and feared for a new war. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill declared that an Iron Curtain had descended across Europe. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin didn't like the idea of West Germany regaining any former power, so in 1948 the Soviets blockaded the western sections of Berlin to force the other Allies to give them control of the whole city. It didn't work, as the Western Allies airlifted supplies in. In 1949, NATO was formed to strengthen the Western Allies. Germany...
All right, so right there at 1 minute 8 seconds, that gives you the answer for this question, part of it. NATO was and is an international organization formed during the Cold War to strengthen the Western Allies against Soviet powers.
They became divided into East and West, as was Berlin itself. Stalin wanted to be in control of the countries on Russia's borders to ensure security. Because of this, the Soviet Union claimed the states it had invaded during the war and established communist regimes within them. Stalin set up secret police within these regimes to crush opposition swiftly. Yugoslavia had been expelled by the Soviets in 1948, but remained its own communist state. Propaganda was spread by East and West to subvert their enemies. The world had been divided into East and West. United States President Harry Truman sought to contain the spread of communism by funding regimes under threat of a communist force.
Okay, here's your second example of one of the proxy wars that was fought during the Cold War. Okay, so you have a Greek Civil War. There are more to come.
Also set up various bodies and organizations to effectively defend United States interests. A new communist power rose in the East in the form of the People's Republic of China in 1949. The old Republic of China retreated to Taiwan and remains there today. Korea had been divided in half after World War II, and both sides claimed to govern the whole country. To help further spread...
Here's another example of a proxy war, the Korean War. And now you see these two ideologies, communism and capitalism. You can see their effects outside of just Europe. They had effects even in Asia, okay?
Communism, China and the Soviet Union aided the northern government to invade into the south. Loads of United Nations countries came in to defend the south, with USA providing the vast majority of troops. The Korean War was fought to a stalemate. The armistice was only agreed after the death of Joseph Stalin. Korea remains divided in a state of ceasefire to this day. 1953 saw Nikita Khrushchev come to power in the Soviet Union. He openly criticized Stalin's rule and sought to move on to bigger and better things. In response to the creation of NATO, he created the Warsaw Pact, an alliance of the Eastern Bloc countries, in 1955. The United States...
All right, beautiful people, so that is the second half of this question. The USSR's, the Soviet Union, aka the Soviet Union, their response to NATO was the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact was an international organization formed during the Cold War to strengthen Soviet Union and its allies, right, so that they could defend themselves against the Western powers if necessary. Both NATO and the Warsaw Pact are examples of international organizations coming together, supranational cooperation, coming together with the common goal of a military defense. So both of these are organizations that formed during the Cold War, and here's what their common goal was: military defense.
States and the Soviets spread their influence in the Middle East, Latin America, Africa, and Southeast Asia. The Soviets backing groups trying to overthrow the old European colonial regimes. Some countries decided to stay out of the Cold War and not take sides at all. The Soviets quelled any rebellion in Eastern Europe with an iron fist. During the 1950s, the USA experienced a Red Scare where people lived in paranoia and suspicion of the spread of communist ideals into America. The McCarthy trials were like witch hunts to root out the communists in the United States. The end of World War II had seen the dawn of nuclear weapons. The USA began to build up an arsenal, and soon the Soviets developed their own nuclear weapons, and the two superpowers spent the 1950s testing them and displaying their might. Many people campaigned against the development of nuclear weapons, seeing the inherent danger. US President Dwight D. Eisenhower thought these weapons could be used to deter other acts of war. Ballistic missiles based on captured Nazi rocket technology were developed so they could launch their missiles from afar. This also led to the space race as the two nations frantically developed more and more technology. The Soviets launched the first satellite and the first man into space, while the United States won the race to the moon. Relations between the Soviet Union and China were worsening throughout the 1960s as they disagreed on how communism should be run. In 1961, the East German government persuaded the Soviet Union to build what would become the Berlin Wall around West Berlin to stop the young, educated people from the East leaving to the more prosperous West. Communism had spread to Cuba in 1959. The United States attempted an invasion, training up Cuban exiles, but it failed. In 1962, the Soviets decided to place nuclear missiles in Cuba to pressure the United States into giving them West Berlin. From Cuba, the Soviets would have first strike capability on the US, countering the US Jupiter missiles placed in Italy and Turkey aimed at the Soviets. This situation led to a serious escalation, almost resulting in total nuclear war, but it was resolved as US President John F. Kennedy and Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles. The Cuban Missile Crisis led to
And what you just saw was this acronym right here, which is basically after a bunch of proxy wars, MAD, SALT, START, and recently with President Obama called the New START. These are all acronyms, but they all refer to, in general, peace agreements. So after years of fighting, after years of war, these acronyms basically represent peace agreements, okay?
Direct hotline being set up between the Kremlin and the Pentagon to at least improve communication between the two superpowers. Khrushchev was ousted 2 years later by his colleague Leonid Brezhnev. France withdrew from NATO, feeling that USA and UK wouldn't share the power. France wouldn't fully return until 2009. War had been raging in the old French colony of Vietnam since 1955 and even before that, between the communist-backed North and the mainly US-backed South. The US involvement...
All right, this is your this is another proxy war, the Vietnam War. Again, you're seeing the ideologies and their impact throughout Europe and Asia.
Grew and grew throughout the 1960s, but ultimately ended in defeat for the South and the US as the North captured Saigon in 1975. It was an embarrassment for the United States as the great superpower lost to such a poor nation. Other US and Soviet-backed conflicts raged throughout the world. Despite these proxy conflicts, the 1970s did see a thaw in the Cold War in a time known as détente, with improving relations between the East and West. The Soviet Union were finding that many of the economies within the Eastern Bloc countries weren't doing as well as the West, so the cooling intention was encouraged. US President Richard Nixon travelled to China and met Chairman Mao and improved their relationship, taking advantage of the split from the Soviets. Nixon also met up with Brezhnev, resulting in the SALT I agreements, which...
So here's another example of an agreement, SALT I, Strategic Arms Limitation Talks. Again, in present day, this is called the New START. And that is essentially President Obama talking to Russia and making peace agreements. Now, the answer here, what are some examples? Here are the examples. The results of this, basically, war doesn't do anything for your economy, and it doesn't help. So you have it die down and become cold. You have a lot of the fire being put out, and it essentially becomes a cold war as a metaphor, because things are dying down and calming down based on these agreements. But here's another example of these peace agreements, SALT I.
Sought to reduce the amount of nuclear weapons being developed to create a more stable environment. They also agreed to not develop anti-ballistic missile defenses to maintain the threat of nuclear war as a deterrent. They increased trade with each other and brought about a period of peaceful coexistence. At the same time, Social Democrat Willy Brandt of West Berlin sought to ease relationships between East and West Germany, as well as Poland and the Soviet Union. The SALT II agreements were signed but never ratified by the United States due to various Soviet dealings around the world, including the deployment of troops in Afghanistan to reinforce a newly established communist regime, which would begin a war that would rage throughout the 1980s. US President Jimmy Carter had the United States boycott the 1980 Moscow Summer Olympics along with 64 other countries. US President Ronald Reagan and his strong ally British Soviets developing anti-ballistic missiles, although one denied its boycott so pulled the anti-George Bush States of America. Fishy, all right. September 3rd, 1989, George Bush.
All right, so what you see, you have the peace agreements here. Why was the war called cold? Because it basically died down. It was a long, extended war that wasn't always, missiles flying and people attacking each other. There were times when it was peaceful. There were times when the war stopped. How did the Cold War create a new Europe? Well, it basically it changed Europe geographic, the physical boundaries, and the overall politics of Europe. Right, the major ideology died after 1989, which was communism. That died after 1989, and this is the symbolic event that represents the death of that ideology. After 1989, when the Berlin Wall falls, along with communism, then you have major changes in Europe, and you can see those changes in Yugoslavia. You can see those changes in Germany as it becomes one country. You can see those changes with Czechoslovakia, the different Baltic republics, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, breaking away from the Soviet Union. So essentially that is the answer here, okay, of the new Europe and new Russia. The Soviet Union becomes Russia, and that is essentially the example and the answer here, okay? So look at this video. These are the answers. Study this video to prepare yourself for the test.